we have our light here, we can move it around and change the lighting. The lighting we can of course position once we know, once we have it in the scene and we can see what angle the light's at, we can just move the light around to match our live action plate and get something that's kind of sympathetic basically to the shot. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. What we do now is we need to save this, of course, Control S. Do a little bit of admin tidy up because we've got our two nice little boxes down here and we've kind of created this, but it's a little bit messy. So let's do a little bit of tidying up on it just to try and make it look a bit decent. Okay, so that's our Mesh 3D. Now with these you can always use, I like quite using these little breaks. Alt lets you add in these kind of little break points, which I find quite handy at times. Right, so that goes there. That goes there. I'm being a bit pedantic, but I just like to have things so I know kind of where everything is. Make it as visual as possible so I can see, all the wiring properly without too many wires crossing behind things. You can sometimes get confused if you kind of have a lot of wires that go behind some things. You can't quite see where they've come from or where they're going to, so I tend to kind of just make sure that they are not crossing each other. Okay, so there we are, we have our setup. So let's get an underlay for it. So I'm just going to click off here and type underlay and F2 to rename it, and I'm going to call this Scar 3D Creation. There we go. And move it over here, grab the bottom right, move it down there, so something like this will work well. Click off. Now there we are, our solution is in a box that we can shift around and continue working. Right, to move on, it's time to connect our 3D solution up to the rest of our composite. So I'm just going to slide this over here a bit to make room for the new nodes. And before I go too far, I will just zoom in here. I'm just going to make an adjustment to the corner pin because it's not quite plain out of the surface. It's fine for testing purposes, but I'm going to select the track, and here is our corner pin box. And I'm going to turn on high quality for this, so I just want to see what I'm doing without all the aliasing issues. This forehead is sort of a bit more. Think of this as a window into which we're going to be placing our scar, which we're going to basically be rendering. Go. I'll try something like that. Maybe just bring it up a bit. See what that looks like at the beginning. Or sorry, at the end of the shot. Just let it cache up there. It takes a little while because it has to render all of that. Control scroll. We'll just zoom back out a bit. As I said, this is very much going to be used as kind of a window to place our scar in. Okay, that looks pretty good to me, so let's click off of that. And I'm just going to fit that back for the moment. Okay, to get our object in here, we need to replace the UV grid with a render of this 3D view here. So we have our 3D model when we have our lights and everything, but at the moment, you know, it's just in a 3D world all on its own. We need to get it into a 2D format so that we can use the corner pin data to place it on the forehead of the actor. To do that, I need a render 3D node, so I'm going to come down here and select the merge node, which is our last node in this creation box, and up here for the shortcut, rather than go looking for it, you can see there's a icon here, so I'm going to click on that. So that gets us render 3D node, and this will now give us a 2D render of this. So now this won't actually work, because if I send this over here, you'll see that it all looks a bit strange. It's filled frame and we're super zoomed in and all that. That's because we don't have a camera. You know, you need a camera for the 3D render to work properly or be rendered into 2D space. Let's make ourselves a camera, or get a camera. Again, there's an icon up here for that. So I'm just going to click off here, and we can actually select the merge node and go cam 3D. Automatically hooks the camera up for us. There we are. As you can see, we lose this image over here, and that's because the camera currently, if we look over here, is at world 0, and it's right in the middle of the sky. In fact, it's slightly behind it because it's bent, so it's not actually seeing anything. So as soon as we pull it back, we should get something, and there we are. So now we are seeing our image. I could pull the camera a long way back, but what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to change the focal length so I can fill this into the frame. So with the camera selected, the properties panel over here, I'm going to change the angle of view, give ourselves a wide angle lens. There we go. It's angle of view. You can also do the focal length by reducing the focal length down. Now we can see the transparency of the alpha channel. Now the thing to note here is the original scar is rectangular, and by that what I mean is if I come down here and I select our diffuse image and I send that to viewer 1 temporarily, you can see that it was a 2048 by 2048 square render, and we want to mimic that, because don't forget the UV grid is also square. So we have a look at that. That is equally square, and it is being mapped, you know, from that square onto there. So we need to kind of keep that relationship going, otherwise we're going to get distortions going on, and we're going to have to compensate. And it's much easier to see things fit properly if we have everything up the pipe that is set properly. Go back to looking at our output there. Again, I'm going to put merge 3D into viewer 1, and we want to change this output. You can see this is 1280/720, and if we select the render 3D node, you can see we come to image tab here, and indeed it is, you know, the 1280/720 format of our project. So this we want to change. We want to mimic the resolution of that bitmap we just saw. So we need to change this to 2048. Tab key and 2048, and there we are. So that is now a square render. If we fit that, you'll see that if we pull back out one more time, control scroll wheel, you'll see we have a 2048 render that mimics the one over here. So what I'm going to do is, just to make sure everything matches, I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to fit this, and then I'm going to move the camera back so that we get a similar kind of relationship between the two. So I'm going to set the camera now. Obviously I can manipulate the camera in the 3D view, but I need to be able to see it to do that, and I want to see these two images. But I can of course go to the control panel over here, and I can equally manipulate the camera over here, and here is the Z axis, so I can just simply move the camera back this way, and there we are. We're now getting our scar moving in that window. And of course with that we can do all sorts of things. We can, for example, manipulate the 3D model so that we get a different rotation and things like that the camera's actually seeing. To do that, we probably want to put a 3D transform node into our setup over here, because we can go to the FBX mesh, for example, which is obviously this object here. In fact, if I select the Merge 3D node and hit 1 to put that in here, just control scroll to zoom back out and scroll wheel to pan. So we can see everything here, and here is our object, and of course it's got a manipulator, and we can manipulate it either with the Merge 3D node, we can manipulate it with the actual mesh itself, because the mesh itself, as you can see, has a lot of controls, manipulator controls for it. However, I always prefer to try and avoid manipulating the initial mesh. It's more flexible to put a transform node upstream of it, because then that way, if something goes wrong or you don't like what you've done, you can simply disable or delete that transform node. So let's make ourselves some space to do that. So I'm just going to shift this up here, and what we need now is a 3D transform. So control spacebar, and I'm going to type in transform, and there we go, we've got transform 3D, that's the one we want. Since we're in 3D space, we want 3D transform. And now we have a 3D transform node, and it's sitting right on top of the one that's over there. And as you can see, we can simply grab it, and we've got the ability now to slide and move around our object. We can also rotate it, and that's quite handy if we want to sort of match up the perspective a bit of the curvature, because obviously this here has a little bit of curvature to it, and if we want to kind of maybe rotate it a bit, we can either do that in this viewport here by switching to the rotation tool. So now you can see we're able to rotate the object, just control Z that, or we can of course, and of course the other thing we can do if we need to is we can roll it, which is very useful, which we'll be using in a bit in a moment. But the other thing of course we can do is we can do it over here as well. So we can quite happily come down here and use these tools as well. Okay, so with that said, let's get these together. So here's our render, and this is what we're going to be outputting, and this is now going to be placed on the forehead of the actor. So where we have our UV grid going in over here, we can simply just attach it in. So I'm just going to bring this down, just get that out of the way. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'll put the edit up here, I'll put the track here, I'm going to feed this in. Okay, so now when we feed this to viewer 2, there we are, we have our scar on the forehead of our actor. So let's bring it up to 100% so we can see it. Okay, so it's a bit small of course, but this is the whole point of what I was saying about making a corner pin window into which we are going to put the scar. So we have our corner pin already set up, and we don't want to change that too much more in case we go off the edge of this, but we can do that if we need to. So what I'm going to do is we can now use this transform tool to position the scar where we want it. So let's do that. Let's maybe bring it down a bit, and let's bring it across a bit like so. Definitely think it wants to be somewhat larger, so scale wise, and you can do the scaling over here, but equally you can come down here and see we've got a scale. If you want to do fine scaling, don't forget hold the control key down as you drag, and that will give you much finer control. So now you can see we can scale up, and if you can't scale up far enough, you can always just type in a much bigger value here. Now you can see we're hitting the edge now, so we're scaling up to the point where we're clipping the edge of the corner pin, but we don't want to go off the edge of the forehead anyway, because obviously that wouldn't make sense. So it's just a case of figuring out where we want to place the scar. The other thing I might want to do is just rotate it a bit, so we can just bring it like this maybe. And the other thing I'm noting here as I'm doing this is the alpha channel that's controlling the fade off, the alpha channel that's clipping our scar is kind of blending it maybe a bit too much, depending on your feeling down here. See, it's clipping off and sort of disappearing. It may be that we'll replace this alpha mask with, you know, this bitmap alpha mask with a actual spline based mask inside of Fusion. But for the moment, there we go, we've got a scar positioned. There's no color grading on it, so it doesn't sit in very well at all at the moment. So we need to fix that. Let's just come up here and just sort it out a bit more. Again, you can see we're sort of hitting the edge of the corner pin here. Anytime that something like that happens, we can actually obviously just alter the corner pin. So if we come to the planar track, you can see we can simply, you know, move the corner pin down to sort of something like this, and then we can reposition the scar, let ourselves get a bit further down towards the brow. So again, let's come back to the transform node and pull it back up, compensate. There we go. So we can do stuff like that. And I think I'll scale it a bit more, so let's just, again you can see we're hitting this side over here. Again, we can come back to the planar track node and bring that sort of out a bit more and compensate the scar back. Clicked off there, be very careful you don't get the right object. Sometimes it's hard to see the gizmos. Maybe something like this. This is where I might want to change the mask, because you see the mask is clipping here, and that's this soft edge here. And it may be that we want a tighter control over the mask with a spline. And I think maybe that's kind of what I'm going to do now, to get more control over where the scar is. The other thing is we need to look at the lighting, of course, because at the moment, as we can see, go in, you might want to match the lighting up a bit better. So let's just zoom out over here, grab our light source. Now you'll notice that nothing happened there, and the reason for that is we didn't turn the lighting on in the render, and you have to kind of do that. So if we come down to the render 3D node, let's go and have a look at the controls for it, and you'll see that there's no lighting enabled for it, which is the default. So we need to turn that on, and there we go. Now we're actually getting the lighting, which we were before, so that would have not helped at the end of the day if we had gone much further. But now, as you can see, we are able to move around, and we've got a much nicer looking scar. And we're looking to match the lighting that's in the scene, because the lighting is on the left here in the scene, which we can quite clearly see. So we just need to make sure that the angle of our light is sympathetic to that. It's a point light, so it'll have a round decay fall off, so you might want to pull it back a bit just to make it fill out a bit better, sort of somewhere back here, so it's lighting more evenly. But I just like the flexibility of a point light, because a spotlight has more parameters than a cone, and it's much more difficult to aim, whereas this you can just shift around, which I find is much easier to kind of work with. And of course we're going to be using some color balancing as well to make this sit in a lot better. Okay, next up, I think what we'll do is we'll look at sort of adding a spline in, but for now this is a kind of good position to be in. I'm actually going to version up this scene now, so I'm going to come up here and I'm going to do save version, so that pushes us up to version 5, and we'll look at the next tweak.